For Poetry London and Radio Western, this is Kevin Heslop with Canisia Lubrin to discuss her 2017 collection from Buckrider Books, Voodoo Hypothesis. With Jack Davis, Canisia will be reading on Wednesday, April 17th at Landon Library for Poetry London. Canisia, there's a line in the title poem which functions, it seems to me, as a kind of turn and means of insight into what this astounding book is doing as a whole. With your permission, I'd like to quote that line out of context. Unless we prove ourselves enigmas. That compulsion towards the enigmatic speaks to something you elaborate upon in your conversation with Sina Kara about what you and others have considered to be the book's intentional and maybe ecstatically necessary difficulty. Opacity and strangeness, I understand, were other terms with which your environment as a writer responded to your early efforts. Could you share a few words about the impulse towards the enigmatic?
Well, I suppose probably the easiest way to put it is to insist that, as the incredible theorist and poet Edouard Glissant put it, is people have a yearning for, collective and personal expression that isn't opposed to themselves. And so it's simply a will to exist in the totality of who you are, of who we are as people. And so that means a refusal to be reduced. And so in a sense, that insistence to be complex, to be full, to be in ways that we are unknowable, and to exist in the things that probably we can grasp, right? And so that confluence and that what exists in that interstice between knowing and unknowing, that's kind of where we are as humans all the time. Yeah.
I wonder whether the formula of an interview is contrary to that sense of the enigmatic, where two people are supposed to speak with a kind of pristine, untroubled clarity, in some ways opposite to the project on the page before you. Is there a way that you're being asked to participate in this conversation that resists what you intend with your work on the page, or are those two sort of forms of expression so different as not to require the same consequence or the same result?
I think so. Yeah, I don't think they require the same consequence. One has to grapple with whether, as an artist, the work can extend into its kind of, ultimate social realm, or into a social realm that we don't really have control of as its creators, right? So to exist in a kind of interview space, talking about a work that has done what it's done, and it's continuing to do things that is beyond what my capacity to do with it as its author would put us here right now. And so this exchange, I think, is an extension, and it need not exist in opposition to what's happening in the book, although it can, in some sense, either make it more complex, trouble it even more, throw things into question, and that's just the nature of how we engage with art, I think.
On the point of cartography, cartographic images separate sections of the book, and cartography, a necessary tool in the colonizer's toolkit, fundamentally resists the enigmatic and opposes multivalence. I wonder if you'd offer a word about including cartographic drawings throughout this collection.
Well, I mean, that was not my decision. This was to my mind, the very commendable instinct of the book designer. She read the book, and then she came up with the book design. And I thought, perfect. I had nothing to add after I saw that first iteration of what she sent. Because, again, the book is existing in a kind of psychogeographic space. And insofar as, how much can we transpose onto the page, the stuff of life, the stuff of real life. And so that hypergeographic space, I think, is a thing that extends beyond its immediate, geographical obsessions, right? As a global reality, the thing that colonization did is that it created a kind of singularity or multiple singularities of displacement, of geographic displacement. And it's still ongoing, and it's actually intensifying, if we were to be honest. So, in a sense, looking at the past, looking at the history of colonization and the prehistory of colonization that we have inherited, and how those things press upon the geographies of the present, I think lines up quite nicely with the kind of work that the topographical maps are doing on the cover and inside the book.
I notice you use the word singularity in that response, and I'm reminded of, in the acknowledgement section of the book, a phrase, Higgs boson thanks to the editors, and assemblers of the book. This language of physics, how do you bring that to bear, and what's the meaning that you associate with the use of the language that would otherwise predominantly be used in the realm of physics?
Of a clinical, so again, the title of the book, Voodoo Hypothesis, is already pointing, or at least gesturing in that direction of what can be considered a science that is maybe wholly distinguishable from what we think language is and what language does. And I really don't have a simple answer to that particular question at the heart of this idea. But I have always had, broad, very far-reaching interests in different disciplines, in multidisciplinary things, and how things that appear completely disparate actually have a way to either cohere or be dissonant in a generative way. So for me, of course, history, and the history that I am investigating in this book is, the kind of colonialities that exist, in ways that are usually wielded against blackness and against, people like myself. And so that language of physics that I'm using in the book isn't just another way to enter the conversation. It's another way to say this is not clinical. These various languages are a way to speak in a different register about things that appear to be, something of the past, or something that we can no longer engage in the same registers that we've been used to engaging with them, because we're not getting anywhere.
Speaking of speaking in different registers, and a word that I noticed came up in your interview with Sheena Cara was the word creolize. And I was wondering if you could maybe sort of free associate on that word for a moment, or explore the import of that word for you.
I did not come up with the word creolization or to creolize. This is a term that comes out of a particular Caribbean poetics. You have folks like Edouard Glissant, even Derek Walcott, who were engaging a kind of creolization, which in the brilliant book Poetics of Relation, Edouard Glissant talks about how opacity functions as a kind of creolité, as a kind of creolization, which basically means you have languages that are either vehicular or vernacular, right? So languages that come from other languages and still carry certain things that are or can be wholly attributed to that one language, or you have languages and various means of expression creating new things entirely, right? And so this sense of creolization, I think, is a kind of diasporic condition. It's a thing where, you've been shoved into a certain context, and you have constantly to do the work of imagining your way out of it, out of its reductions, out of its unhumaning, out of its refusal to see you as human. And so that kind of import, I think, it will extend into almost everything I do. I don't see how there's another way I can approach the work that I'm trying to do without at least some gesture to this idea of a creolized world, because it's what we're getting more and more of.
Imagining one's way out of that oppressive context, I think, is borne upon by a line by Gwendolyn Brooks that you use as an epigraph for a poem in this collection. If not a note, a whole. If not an overture, a desecration. which seems to me to suggest a kind of obligation of the artist, of a racialized artist. And that seems an extreme, if that reading of that statement is correct, that seems an extremely high bar, if not a note, a whole. There's a sort of constant obligation to be productive artistically. Is that the way that you read that line? And if so, do you approach the process of production as an artist as a sort of obligation?
No, I don't think I can call it that, but I can. I don't think I can call it an obligation to produce. But what I think I can, the way I inhabit that particular epigraph, that poem from Boy Breaking Glass, is kind of looking at how one, again, has to constantly orient and reorient oneself in a world that will reduce one to feces, that will, constantly reduce. And, this tendency we have to praise what we tend to think of as accessible is another way of contending to the, with one's complexity. It just does it with a different kind of language. And so, for me, that desecration, that overture, is the kind of hyperspace of reclaiming the self, of having to constantly reclaim the self, and to simply live, and to not seek permission to live, because one, one exists in this kind of remediated space where either you have to take part in this mandatory wage labor, and you have to do this and you have to do that, and there's almost no time to sit with yourself. There's almost no time to check in with the things that are truly important for people from day to day. And I think this insistence that racialized artists are obligated to produce within those strictures is also hearkening back to the same thing that we're trying to get away from. And so to be able to live and to exist, and to not have to put forward a thesis for why that is in a certain way, in a certain register. So yeah, that there's a lot happening in there, but I don't want to think of it as an obligation to produce.
I suppose that that the way in which one's requirement to participate in wage labor and work of meaning and value that is also informed by one's literary endeavors for a poet is as a teacher. And I wanted to turn conversation towards Dionne Brand, who in 2018 curated an anthology, The Unpublished City, in which a piece of your fiction was included. And I wonder if you'd say a few words about the impact of Brand's work upon your early years as a writer, and also how you approach the role of teaching as you do at Humber and at the University of Toronto.
Well, I will never tire of singing Dionne Brand's praises. Being her student was a life-changing experience for me. I had met Dionne Brand through her work many years before, actually sitting in a classroom as one of her students, and I had no idea precisely what I was trying to do with what I was writing before I actually entered the sounds and the expansive intelligence and the just brilliant art that Dionne Brand has been writing for so many years. So that impact is exponential, and I have no way of ever paying it back or adequately putting into a kind of graspable expression the immense impact that has had on my life and on my work.
Have you said something to that effect to her before? And I wonder, if so, what her response has been.
Well, I mean, Dionne is a ceaselessly humble person, and she carries all of that greatness and that intelligence and that brilliance and that vast compassion so lightly, that you marvel at the fact that a human like that actually exists. And so, yeah, she's extremely gracious, and she's Dionne Brand in the room, but she's, she has a way of just not shattering the room with her greatness at the same time. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, she's just a really, really, truly remarkable human being. And I think I have had a number of chances to at least try and extend some of what I've learned into my own teaching, my own practice. I approach the classroom with a great degree of curiosity, with a great appreciation for exploration, and as a kind of collaboration between myself and the students, right? Because if the classroom is an environment that is conducive to learning, everyone's learning, and that includes the teacher. And so, yeah, that tends to be my basic philosophy around that.
Speaking of classrooms, I wonder if you'd say a few words about how important to Voodoo Hypothesis your MFA at Guelph was, and what that space allowed you or afforded you, and what that experience was like for you.
I will probably precede that by saying that Voodoo Hypothesis is the work of perhaps my whole life. It didn't start in the University of Guelph,
right.
And it certainly didn't end there. I actually did my MFA in fiction, and I took one poetry class while at the University of Guelph MFA, and that was with Dionne Brand. And yes, the impact of that was huge. Voodoo Hypothesis would not have happened without that one workshop. And I wrote some of the earliest poems of that manuscript in that workshop. And then, in all honesty, the book happened after I had completed the MFA, right? Because I was writing a novel in the MFA. And so, yeah, and I did find, of course, your usual, convening with peers, testing ideas with peers, and the structure of the MFA is still such that one can come into the program and leave either with some sense of what one wants or what one doesn't want. And I think that's kind of the same for every classroom, especially given the kind of normative structure of tertiary education that we have to contend with. But yeah, that whole thing was a good experience. It opened a lot of doors for me. And again, one semester with Dionne Brand has done a whole world of good for me.
Wow. Can you give me a sense of how she would facilitate workshops? Like, were there sort of tendencies that she would revert to, or ways of eliciting conversation about one another's pieces? Just what she was like as a teacher during that semester.
She made a lot of room for students. That's her generosity. And that's kind of what you need. I personally don't think that I would do very well with a highly prescriptive classroom.
Right.
But she does open the door for students to really flex their disciplinary muscles. Because again, the nature of the MFA at Guelph is that you have students coming in from many different disciplines, engineers, lawyers, etc. They're not all trained as writers. So that sort of classroom environment is by itself a kind of richness, right? And I think that's part of its magic. But Dionne has a way of making room for students to really just open up the conversation the way they would open up the conversation, and she has that immense wisdom to say the right thing at the right time. And so a single phrase can set you off for a whole week of good writing. You know what I mean? So she's just sage.
Yeah, that sounds like that's a beautiful crystallization of what wisdom is, being able to say the right thing at the right time.
Yeah, really.
So before I ask you to read a piece from Voodoo Hypothesis, speaking of saying the right thing at the right time, you're to appear in London at Landon Library on April 17th to read before an audience. And I was wondering what you would ask an audience to arrive to your work with, and with what would you hope they depart?
That's a very good question. All I ask is for attention. You know, the kind of openness and generosity that attention would elicit, and to leave. I don't know if I can, if I can say what they leave the poem with, but hopefully they get a sense of possibility. You know, a way of having turned the head in a way that probably they're not used to. You know, a way to view, or a way to see, or feel, or hear, or smell that is in some way not what they're used to.
Do you feel that
And hopefully,
since you produced, or I suppose published this book in 2017, as you've been giving readings, you've been met with that sort of response from audiences? Or could you characterize the response that you've received, not just critically or on the page, but from people who've heard you read or who have engaged deeply with the text and spoken with you?
Right.
Have you got a sense?
I could not give you a sense of the criticals. I don't read any reviews of my work, and
that's probably wise.
Audiences are you get a wide range of responses from readers and listeners, right? So anything from the perplexed reader or listener to, you know, the one that's come up with tears, and you know, the one who's you know, somehow fired up for conversation. You know, it's
Right,
different.
right.
It's different for each, you know, reader, I think. Yeah.
I'm reminded of an adjective that again recurred in your dialogue with Sina Cara, prismatic. Yeah, I notice you have a tendency towards this word. I mean, I wonder if, again, I might ask for a few thoughts about the import of that word for you.
I think it's connected to that exact sense of opacity that we're talking about before, that we are to open us up to complexity rather than close us down to what is reducible and apprehendable and something absolutist. I am anti-absolutist. And so I think that's kind of where it is. It's possibility, it's complexity, it's our multiplicity that we can revel in. And that is what, that is the kind of space, I think, that is rich for the kind of interactions that we want in a world that is liberated and free. Yeah. Because we tend to clamp down when we think in absolutist terms, right? And we don't need any more of that, I don't think. Like, the world can do with less of that. And so to open us up to our prismatic selves, I think would probably put us eminently in a place that we can appreciate that sort of prismaticness of others.
Brilliant. May I ask you now to read a poem from this extraordinary collection?
Sure. Which one? Did you have one in mind, or?
I was thinking the title poem, Voodoo Hypothesis, if possible.
Okay, yeah. I could do that. It's a bit long.
It's all right.
Okay.
We've got a few minutes.
Sure. Here we go. Voodoo Hypothesis. Before sight, we imagine that while they go out in search of God, we stay in and become God, become curiosity, whose soul is a nuclear battery because She'll pulverize Martian rock and test for organic molecules in her lab within a lab within a lab. She doesn't need to know our fears. So far, too grand for ontology reckoning. Did you not land with your rocket behind you? Hope beyond hope on the tip of your rope, with the kindness of anti-gravity slowing you down. You before me, metal and earthen. But I am here to confirm or deny the millions of small things that 7 minutes of success were hinged upon. And I was little more than idea and research in the hypnotic gestures of flame and Bunsen burner, and into parachute. No one foresaw the bag of rags at the end of the tunnel. All memory now, this paraclete. Where else is a pocket of air more deadly than the atomic bomb? Would this only happen on Earth? Has Mars run out of tolerance for the minutiae of air pockets, fingerprints, and worry? Curiosity and her clues to calm our fears for what's coming. Mars and her epic storms. Her gargantuan volcanoes have long ceased their trembling. Her crazy flooded plains, frozen, and in cinema. Martian life, now Earth, and Revelations phases. Earth's problem, not Mars' problem. But why should I unravel over all this remembering? Great thing about landing is that I've arrived at your service, at your sand, at your valley and unsentimental magma. Before me screams plains like Mojave Desert, Waikiki, Nagasaki, nothing too strange to keep curiosity off course. Even though the Viking missions found no conclusive pulse, and we declared you dead, O Mars, never mind that we named your heights and depths from orbit. And from your spheres of minerals where oceans once roared, we've learned little of your lenience for empire. Forgive us what spirit uncovered in the silica of your ancient hot springs. Ah, yes, we've come back home. Phoenix told us we inherited the numberless stories of your hydraulic pathologies, but I am curiosity. If I kill the bitch right, she'll take us deeper and convince us to send earthlings to set up earth colonies on your deserts. They won't ever come back, but that's not so bad when we trade in the grander scheme. As though the colonials, the tribe traders, and all the pharaonic masquerades of gone times were not a fair threat. That we won't know the depth of our homeward seas is nothing, when the sun still got our backs. And while oceans still vaporize before us, curiosity will keep on until the organic secrets of that Martian puzzle become as household to us as carbon. Oxygen wasn't the only disaster to befall Earth. To bless her with life, Apollo drilled on the moon and got stuck, and the more we've drilled down here, the more we've loosened our screws. Perhaps there'll be no one left to give a damn about the death of our privates. Unless we prove ourselves enigmas, the alien we think we know is the alien we only dream up, starting from the bottom of the curious. We wake and die through the crowns and thorns and crane chapters. We move too quick for understanding. Still, through the decades we predict, curiosity confirms the cold flame dust. Then come her conches blown. In the hard-won postcards, traveling on space dust faster than a bullet to say, hey, I'm here. I save. Wish you were here. See Gale Crater, Mount Sharp, just as you said. Come bask with me in the wonders of a Martian. Good afternoon, you of flowering faith. Set sail for home, because we will all wear the consequences of this choice, and you never should have said goodbye.
That was Canisia Lubrin reading from her collection, Voodoo Hypothesis. She and Jack Davis will read for Poetry London at Landon Library on Wednesday, April 17th at 7:30 p.m. Canisia, thank you for the extraordinary and distinct privilege and pleasure of getting to speak with you.
It's a true honor. Thank you so much.